Hey everyone, this is Rick Gualtieri, and welcome to another Tales of a Midlist author. Um, Before we get into this week's topic, wanted to give a quick update from last week. I know last week I talked about story tenses, and I gave some examples. One I didn't have an example of was third person omniscient, and of course, as luck would have it, I started reading a book this week that actually I think is a good example of a story done well in third person omniscient. And also, I think it's a kind of a fun story, and also gives me a chance to plug a friend. If you get a chance, check out Drew Hayes's Secondhand Curses. I was reading it just the other day, and I was like, wait, this is third person omniscient. Why couldn't I have read this last week and mentioned it? So I'm gonna mention it now as a pretty good example, and also an excellent story. Maybe about a third of the way through it, but definitely digging it. So, all right, that out of the way. Welcome. As you can see behind me, the packages are starting to stack up. As I said, this place turns into Santa's workshop right before the holidays. It's probably only going to get higher for a bit, and some of those things are going to turn into actual wrapped gifts. And then we'll go back to the normal chaos that's behind me, which never really gets all that neat. One of these days, I'm just gonna probably take a snow shovel and just clean this place out, but not today. Today, I wanted to talk about the concept of staying in your lane. This has, depending on who you are, this might have different connotations. I know it also has kind of a political aspect of it. We're not talking about that. This is a bit of an advanced topic because typically it assumes that you've had some success with some books or some series. Because, here's the thing. If you're just starting off, the staying in your lane thing is probably less important because you're still testing out, trying to find what works. And this kind of assumes that you already have something that's working. Staying in your lane, the concept there is when you get known for something, when you start to make a name for yourself out there, and then you decide to start writing something completely different. That's pretty much what the idea is. And the question there is, what is kind of the smart way of doing it? And as usual, there's no right or wrong answer here. There's a lot of it's all just guidelines, but here's some thoughts to that. And this also doesn't kind of take into account pen names, because the idea behind pen names is you're kind of divorcing that name from yourself a little bit. Even if you tell people, hey, I actually do write as Caravance, and occasionally put out some risque books, which, by the way, I do. Even telling people that, it still kind of divorces the name, just for for everyday purposes from you. The assumption here is that you're probably sticking with similar name, or hitting that same fan base. Now, the reason this is an issue is, and I've seen it happen to a lot of authors out there, and hell, it's happening to me as well, is that you write something, it hits pretty well, it sells decently, you get known for that, and then you say, yeah, but I also have other ideas, let me try something different. And then you try that something different, and maybe it doesn't work so well. And part of the reason there that it might have not worked so well is that people know you for one thing, and when they see your name and they're like, oh, hey, Rick Gualtieri, he writes funny stuff. And then you pick up Bigfoot Hunters, and you're like, wait, this isn't funny. People are dying, and it's horror. The fuck? The idea there is that you run the risk of turning off those existing readers, and that kind of can come in two forms. One, it can come in the form of obviously the financial hit of people just saying, yeah, I really liked your one series about fallen angels, but now you're reading about werewolves. I don't give a crap about werewolves, so I'm just going to move on. There's that financial hit. Because you technically have to find a whole new audience there. You're making that mistake of saying my audience as they are now will buy that stuff, which the reality is that might not be the case. As authors, once you hit the mid list, you're probably going to hear from people the whole concept of if you write it, I will read it. And as awesome as that is to hear, reality, well, let's be honest, tends to be a little bit different there. I know. I do the same thing. There's some authors I love to write, but if they write something I have no interest in, I'm not going to buy it. There's only so much time in the day for me to read or stuff, and I want to grab something that interests me. So there's the financial hit aspect of it. Then there are reviews, and this is one that kind of annoys me a little bit. I try not to get upset about reviews. I mean, my general thought is, hey, you bought a book or you downloaded it in KU because you have a valid subscription. Once you've done that, you are more than free to say whatever the hell you want about a book. I'd prefer you not get personal and be like, well, hey, I read this book, it's awful. That must make the author and his family an awful person. I'm not a big fan of those, but well, again, it is what it is. But I will say it does kind of annoy me when I do read stories, when I do read reviews for my other stories, and they immediately compare them to my other stuff, and it's like, it's not meant to, this has nothing to do with that. So you're comparing apples and oranges. And again, I'm not going to tell people you can't do that because, well, it's your right to do so. But the whole concept of straying out of your lane is you run that risk of people are going to be like, oh, it's like 1 star, isn't funny like their Sasquatch books or so. When you're like, it wasn't meant to be funny. This is a thriller. It's not a Sasquatch comedy. So those are probably the two risks you run, depending on how well you're doing with stuff. I mean, one could be of greater concern than the other. I know just in general everyday thing, the financial hit is probably the bigger concern for most. But the review thing doesn't help matters because if you rack up enough people saying, yeah, it's a good story, but it's not this story, that I'm comparing it to, that can really help. That can hurt your your review average, which in turn could affect sales. So that is kind of the downsides of not staying in your lane. The upsides of staying in your lane obviously are that if you keep riding that that same boat, and assuming you're not writing in a hot topic or a hot genre. And what is a hot genre? A hot genre is something that kind of comes out of nowhere. Think of the 50 Shades craze. Obviously erotic romance has always been big, but it was huge after 50 Shades of Grey came out. So it was a hot genre. Lit RPG, harem romances. These are all considered hot genres because they kind of come out of nowhere. They're huge for a bit, but the thing with that is, are they sustainable huge? Like romance, as I mentioned, has always been big, and it will always continue to be big. It just might not, certain subgenres of it might not be. But the thing about that is, what I'm saying is, if you're writing in a hot genre, you always run that risk of the well running dry where it's just not hot anymore. And that happens. What I'm more talking about is if you have a sustained career in a genre that is relatively steady, urban fantasy, cozy mysteries, romance, and you're able to keep that pace and maintain it. The idea behind staying in your lane is that you can continue to grow book after book with that, in theory, assuming you're putting out quality work, and grow upon that and maybe spin-off series and such. And you're staying in your lane, and you're you're continuing to increase your financial thing. You're building up a fan base. And in theory, what you're going to find is if you do that, as subsequent books, the review averages tend to go higher, because if people didn't like you to begin with, they wouldn't have gotten to those subsequent books, and they're already fans of the series, so they kind of already know your writing style and all that. And assuming you just don't screw the pooch, you're probably going to see that happen. And I mean, let's be honest, that and of course there are limits. I mean, we can talk about jumping the shark and stuff, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this. So that's kind of the idea of those are the benefits of staying in your lane. Benefits of getting out of your lane are that, I don't know about you, but I get bored writing the same damn thing. And I mean the same genre. I love urban fantasy. I love writing it. But the thing is, I love writing horror too. And I like writing comedy. I consider myself a multi-genre author. So in some cases, you kind of have to suck it up and be like, okay, well, I can either do pen names for all of those, which honestly, I don't like to do too many, only because sometimes it becomes a pain in the ass if something does grow larger and then you have to manage multiple social media and stuff. Maybe hiring, I guess, an assistant for that, but I really don't have time for that myself. But also the thing is, for some people it works. Think of James Patterson. He is all over the place with regards to genre. His name is its own genre, so he can pretty much write what he wants. I mentioned Drew Hayes earlier. Drew is another one who seems to be able to he kind of established earlier that his lane is almost not being in a lane. So he kind of is able to do fantasy, superhero and stuff and make it work. Not always the same for for everybody. So I would say the concept of not staying in your lane and like continuing to succeed is probably less common than the opposite. But again, there's that risk reward thing of some people are happy staying in their lane, doing it, and hey, their stuff continues to grow book after book, and that is awesome. Personally, as I said, my mind wanders, and even if it does make financial sense, sometimes I have a story elsewhere that I want to tell, and it's close enough to what I'm doing where it doesn't make sense to use a pen name. But it's also not necessarily in my core lane. I've been trying to differentiate that a little bit with Rick Gualtieri versus R. Gualtieri on my book covers. To limited success, but I'm trying to, as with everything, you have to kind of, I guess, train people to expect certain things. Rick Gualtieri, I try to say, okay, if it's Rick Gualtieri, this is comedic fantasy, and if it's R. Gualtieri, then I'm kind of stepping out of my lane and maybe either doing horror or maybe doing fantasy that's like a little more serious or so. So, it's an ongoing thing. So I just really wanted to give you the thoughts on that. Ultimately, only you can decide upon what your career is. But it is a topic that does come up, and I will say it is a valid thing because I've seen it happen more than once. People are like, "Hey, my first series did great, and I decided to try something different for my second series, and it tanked." And it's because they built up a fan base, and when they moved over to that next thing, the fan base didn't come with them, and they essentially kind of had to start over again with that series, which is the risk you run. That said, I mean, if you were the type who can find that lane and stick in it and own it, you can reap the rewards. Or if you are able to be that exception and just be able to be like, hey, I can write whatever I want and people really will follow me. That's great. But these are all risks to take into account and things to think about as you're writing that next book. I know personally what I'm trying to do for 2019 is, I won't say it's staying in my lane, but I'm trying to work on my funnels, which basically means that I'm trying not to start too many new projects, as opposed to I'm trying to finish my series and trilogies that I started, which I think probably more contributes to my thing, is I tend to bounce around too much, and I think I established early enough that I don't necessarily stay in a lane, but it still hits me every so often. But I do have at least a little bit of freedom as long as I follow up. If I put out one book in one genre, another book in another genre, another book in another, that's not going to help me. With me, I'm working on follow through. So that is one thing to consider. If you are not going to stay in your lane, at least work on the follow through and make sure that if you are going to work in something else, you establish yourself there, and then you can work on segmenting your mailing lists, what have you. To whatever makes sense, which is also something I need to work on. All right, my name is Rick Gualtieri. This is Tales of a Midlist Author. I think I've beaten this one to death enough. A relatively short topic, but I think an important one for people to take into account. And I just wanted to offer this. We are moving into the holiday season now. I might be taking a hiatus from this for a couple weeks, just because the craziness of doing this on a Friday or Saturday and then getting up for a Sunday for the holidays. I might need to just take a couple weeks off to deal with the holidays, just because. And I think you're going to see this with a lot of people with a lot of podcasts and such. I just wanted to give you that heads up. So I definitely will be back on this, but this should be coming out. Let's see here. This should be coming out on the 16th. After this, I might hold off on these until January, just to take a small break. But we'll see. I'm just giving you that heads up now. All right, I will talk to you again really soon. And if I don't talk to you again before then, have a very happy, safe, and hopefully loving holiday.